My name is Richard Nielsen, and I teach at Boston College, and I work in the area of ethics, leadership, engagement methods, conflict resolution, and political economy.
And so how did you become involved in business ethics?
When I was a kid, growing up in New York City, first Brooklyn and then Queens, and then we went out to the island, there were several instances where many people saw that there was unethical behavior going on. There was corruption going on, and they didn't do anything. It wasn't a question of understanding. They were big, important things. And people were getting killed, lots of money was being stolen. And so I would ask people, why didn't you do anything? Because I was only 12 years old at the time when I first noticed this was going on. And they said, we can't. They're too strong. We don't have the power. And if we do anything, they'll hurt us. They'll retaliate against us. And two, we don't know what to do. Given the circumstances of the huge power differentials, I don't know what we can do. And so that struck me. And I wrote my dissertation about how to try to motivate people who feel powerless, fatalistic, what the communications and economic development people called fatalism, what the psychologists called external locus of control, what the sociologists called alienation. And ever since then, I've been trying to find out ways to try to help people who feel relatively powerless to be able to help themselves and the people they love and care about. Now, the problem I saw when I was 12 years old hasn't changed very much. People are still afraid. They recognize the power differentials. And many people are still don't know what to do. For example, I interviewed people from the Challenger disaster many years ago, and the engineers, and they said the same thing. We knew they were going to die. We knew that was wrong, but we were afraid, and we didn't know what we could do in that circumstance. And then as I traveled more around the world, I found this was a near universal problem. People living in hierarchical societies and organizations, for the most part, it's not a problem of understanding what's ethical. They know that stealing money is unethical. They know that cutting corners and on earthquake-prone areas, not putting enough iron in the cement, watering down the cement. When the earthquake comes, people will die. The engineers know it. The employees know it. And this is when I got into the political economic system and found that this system of crony capitalism, where you have corrupt government officials of the left and the right who selectively give the state's business to their friends in exchange for 10, 20% kickbacks, political donations, is very common. We have dimensions of it in the United States. The city I grew up in, New York, I didn't know the words then. I didn't know that was a system. But by going out of the country and working in Latin America and working in the southern Mediterranean, the eastern Mediterranean, and Indonesia and Pakistan, where the system was much more obvious, I tried to understand it. But then came sometimes when people get so frustrated, there's another reaction besides fatalism, it's violence. Not just by the oppressor, but by the victims. So I was trying to also study conflict resolution at the same time to try to do peaceful change. And that's what I've been doing most of my life. Now, out of that came a kind of a new epistemology that's relatively not new in the sense that Aristotle didn't know about it, but new in the sense that most philosophers and social scientists don't do it. For example, the normal social science model is you read the social science journals, you look for a literature gap that is of interest to the scholars that may have very little relevance to anything going on in the real world. Then you find a convenient data sample and you test it. And you move on to the next one, and you do it again and again and again and again. And in philosophy, it's not that different. It's people read the philosophical journals, they identify deductively a literature gap, and they'll either make reasoning-based judgments about what the correction to that literature gap should be, but for the most part, they won't take the next step of saying, well, what can we do about that? Now, the next step could be we pay attention to the data. We go back to the literature, either in philosophy or in the social sciences. And when we don't find the answer there, a practical answer to the problem, that's a gap. And we work with the people in the field, the practitioners, to try to find solutions. And when we do, we record when those solutions work and when they don't. And that becomes practice-based theory building, what I think Aristotle talked about as praxis. So there's an epistemology that I think more people could use. But if anything, it's getting worse. The pressures in academia to publish in the narrow, most rigorous journals, for the most part, think academics don't have very much to learn from practitioners. We have the answers, and we have to figure out better ways to get them to do what we think they should do. And it's not theory building based on the gaps in the practice. And for me, the biggest gap in the practice has been these gigantic power differentials and these lack of knowledge about, again, not what's right or wrong. For the most part, people understand that, but lack of knowledge about what can I do about what is not good enough or what's wrong to try to solve the problem. And I never intended to be working so closely with practitioners, but almost everything I've written is based on work I've done with practitioners in many different parts of the world.
What about your whole screaming double loop, triple loop?
Well,
maybe you can explain that. I can explain it for you.
Yeah, that was much more of interest to social sciences than it was any practice.
Tell me what that is.
Oh, the action learning. Now, the man who invented that, Chris Ardress, he was not like that. He did practice-based theory building, but then he developed a very sophisticated way of analyzing it from a social psychological perspective, where a single loop is where you simply try to accept what you're told from the hierarchy, and your job as a leader or a creative person is to figure out more efficient ways of doing what the hierarchy wants you to do. And double loop action learning is where you stop and you ask yourself, is this thing that they want us to do a good thing, a bad thing? Should we be doing something else? That kind of critical thinking, where the normal person is willing to examine about what they're being told and the assumptions behind what they're being told. For example, in finance, the concept of liquidity covers an enormous number of sins. So when you steal money, destroy wealth, redistribute money, and create no wealth, they say, yes, we're not creating wealth. We're just redistributing it. We're getting rich in the process. But the social benefit we have is we're creating liquidity. which makes it easier, more efficient for the current system to function. So that's that first order single loop. And then there's the second order that I talked about, where you question the assumptions. Now, the little contribution I made to that was to say, well, we have to look at a third loop. And what that is questioning not just the individuals, but the culture of the organization, the compensation system that are causing even the people at the top to do what they're doing. And say that we have to change our compensation system. We have to change our composition of the board of directors. But then there's also a fourth level, even a more macro level, of the fourth loop between the external environment, the organization, individuals' values, and their behaviors. And that's the political economic system. Because you could be a good individual, you get to work for an organization, and you're socialized into the organization. And you could even be a good organization, but then you're socialized into the political economy that you work in. And at the end of the day, you become a very efficient accomplice in perpetuating the injustices and the unethical behaviors. So I don't use that language anymore, because I'm trying to work more with the practitioners and the people that are going to be managers and employees and observers. And I'm not sure that language helps very much. So I just try to explain it as we have different levels of the macro, external environmental level, the meso-organizational level, and the micro-individual level. And the source of the problem can be at any one of those levels. But in order to know what will be more and less effective, we have to know the power of these different levels, and how to engage with the problem and the people, given how many levels it's coming through. And it could be an unethical person. It could be a key individual who doesn't understand. But it could be the compensation system, the organization, where they say, we talk safety, but we only measure and reward cost control. The British Petroleum example. Or we could say the individuals know that. They know the compensation system, but the political economic system is, if you pay the Democrats or the Republicans for their campaign contributions, for the most part, you don't have to worry about enforcement of the laws, because the prosecuting attorneys at the federal level are all political appointments. The federal judges are political appointments. The former prosecutors are then appointed to be the judges. And every once in a while, the people that appointed them remind them, you should remember how you got that job.
Don't forget me, yes.
And even really good Scandinavian organizations that I've worked with that in their own countries are good at the individual, organizational, macro, environmental level. Even when they're working in third world countries, they'll have rules like, we will never pay any money to a corrupt politician, or any politician for that matter. We'd rather do away with the business. But when they come to America, this company, I've been training their third world people for 25 years, you have to pay the Americans. We have to give the money to the Republicans and the Democrats. Because if we don't, the next time we ask for a drug, it'll be delayed a year. And in the pharma business, a delay of a year is a gigantic effect. And then there are bagmen in Washington on both the Republican and the Democratic Party. And the big pharma companies, the big financial institutions, pick these senators, these congressmen, and say, for your caucus, you pick who you want the money to go to. And the deal is, yes, we'll oppose drug pricing, But when it comes to it, it won't get out of committee, and we're not going to press too hard, and it'll never pass. And for example, in pharma, the big lie that we have to have gigantic, exaggerated drug prices because we finance research and development. American pharma companies spend 10 times as much on sales promotion as they do R&D. And that sales promotion goes to greasing these wheels. And it's not even illegal, because for the most part, senators and representatives not only never read the things they vote on, but the laws and the rules and the regulations, the administrative law, are written by the lobbyists. So this sort of crony capitalist kind of system where the politicians are linked to the companies that pay the politicians, even though it isn't as obvious as it would be in Southern Europe, we have key dimensions of that in the United States. And we don't talk very much about, okay, if that's the reality, what can an individual do? What can an organization do? How do we influence the political economic system to change that? And for example, there's a piece of legislation now pending about the Stop Wall Street looting, which is basically designed to try to make leverage buyouts illegal. And the way a leverage buyout works is you borrow gigantic amounts of money to take over a company. And most of the money that you borrow, you pay yourself cash dividends. But you don't want to keep it forever. You want to get rid of it. So what you have to do is cut wages, benefits, outsource, to make it look like the profits are going up because of your leverage buyout. And then you get out once you've sold it again. But then the new managers and the employees are stuck with this gigantic amounts of debt. Now, for example, the first Amazon was Sears Roebuck. Instead of the internet, they had the catalog. The delivery was the railroads to the local general stores, basically what Amazon is doing today. But Amazon was taken over by a leverage buyout guy, or excuse me, Sears was taken over by a leverage buyout guy. They squeezed the company. They had no money to keep up or even get into the kind of Amazon business, even though they invented it. Toys R Us, and we could go on hundreds of companies where this has happened, where value has not only not been created, it's been redistributed to the leverage buyout guys and their investors, and companies that produce wealth, the original Aristotelian idea for business to create wealth because poverty is no good, is being destroyed. But nobody will oppose it. The chance of that law getting passed, the Democrats will vote against it 5-1. The Republicans will vote against it maybe 6-1. But the key thing is that they'll both agree it should never pass.
So that's part of your, I mean, that's sort of, I would call it your agenda, is to keep fighting these things.
Yes.
They keep occurring. And so, these are huge questions. I would agree. But do you see any place else very few people in business ethics, as you know, focus on your type of agenda.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. And that's why
you're still here.
Yes, but also I worry that we're going to increasingly marginalize ourselves substantively. Mm-hmm. And
you mean as a country or
as a field?
As a field, thank you.
As an academic field.
Yes.
Where the people that do the hiring look at us as, we don't expect you actually to teach anyone something worthwhile, but you go through a sorting process. and you will socialize the students, and you will select the smart ones. And then we will socialize them into behaving the way we want them to do. And when we say we're teaching them critical thinking, we're not. We're teaching them how to be more efficiently do what the people in more power want them to do. We're teaching them how to go along and get along. We're teaching them how to be intellectual technicians where they bridge meaningless gaps that are of very little relevance.
So you would say that one of the tasks then, neglected of a business ethicist in the classroom, is to not just teach that, right? Not to teach socialization. So how do you do that by cases? How do you do that in the classroom?
I do it using two kinds of cases. Big cases that they all hear about in the news, like the British Petroleum case. And depending on the country, I'm doing this in different kinds of cases. But then I'll also ask them to come up with their own cases and ask themselves a number of questions. You know, what was good or bad in this situation? And then ask them, what are you worried about? Do we have to make it better, or do we have to stop some of the bad stuff? And then what's the cause? Is it at the individual level, the organizational level, the macro environmental level? And then when they think they might have a handle on the cause, we ask the students, okay, so what are we going to do? What's a realistic objective, given who you're going to be in your own case? And what's the macro ethics, leadership, or engagement strategy you're going to use? What are the micro implementation methods? But always realize that no matter how good your plan is, plans always go wrong, or very often go wrong. So what would be different kinds of scenarios that could make your first plan not work? And I ask them to look at 3 different scenarios and then say, which one do you think is most likely? So if that happens, what contingency plan would you use? And then after they come up with that, they may have to revise their objective. They may have to revise. For example, if the assumption is that the chief executive officer is an honest, ethical person who believes in the vision and values, suppose that's not right. Suppose this is coming from the top. So you might switch from trying to evoke through dialogue the vision and values of the organization, perhaps to secretly threatening to blow the whistle, either inside the organization or outside the organization.
So you're pushing them.
I hope I'm not pushing them.
No, I don't mean pushing them that way.
You know, I mean, I'm trying to empower them. But I probably do have to hold myself back a little bit, not to be a salesman for ethics, you know. Pete Seeger, I talked to many years ago, and he said that the students that he has, he was teaching at Vassar for a while, and he says they're no different with respect to the values of the people I knew in the 30s and the 40s, the 50s and the 60s. But the students today have much less hope that they can do anything. So they compartmentalize. Ethics are for my family, my friends, my personal network. And if I ever get to the top, I won't order anyone to do anything illegal or unethical. But in between, which is most of my professional life, I'll go along and get along.
So how do you see the future of business ethics? What should we be doing we're not doing?
Much more on the practice-based theory building and much more on the engagement methods to solve ethical problems in the field.
And what sorts of issues do you imagine we're going to be facing? The same ones 20 years from now, or things? What sorts of things do you imagine?
Well, if we don't change, I think we'll be increasingly marginalized and will just be considered an abstract intellectual discipline that, as part of our self-image, we like to think we're teaching ethics and we care about ethics. But then we have to look, who are they hiring? Now, if they're hiring adjuncts to teach the courses with no possibility of tenure, and the adjuncts are usually either young philosophers who don't know anything about business or older practitioners who don't know anything about ethics, and they're teaching mainly undergraduates who have very little experience. If they're nice people and they bring donuts to class and they have reasonable exams, the students will be happy because they've been intellectually challenged and they don't know it's irrelevant. And if we do that well enough, and we publish that in the top management, finance, accounting journals, we'll be legitimate members of the field, but just as irrelevant as the other professors are doing very rigorous work, but it doesn't mean anything. I'll just take the social sciences. On a really good day, you can explain 25% of the variance. On a super good day, you can increase that explanation to 25.5%. Now, how many of us would get on an airplane where we're only 25% confident that plane was going to land? But we don't like to even address that kind of question because what we're doing is interesting. It's intellectually interesting, cognitively interesting, but not very interesting in terms of having any kind of real effect. I remember in the financial crisis of 2008, I talked to a bunch of ethics officers, and I said, not one of you guys was a player in this. Not one of you did anything. Why not? He says, we never get invited to the meetings where these things are decided. That stuff comes from the top. We go after the middle and the lower level. And usually it's also, we go after stuff where employees are doing something that's going to hurt our organization. But if they do things that are going to benefit our organization, then we're going to let it go. We're going to say, next time, don't do that. And they won't do it next time because it's changed. The situation's changed. And then at the macro level, they say, let's say you're working at Goldman. So we have to pay another $5 billion fine. Who cares? As soon as we settle and there'll be no criminal prosecutions and all we have to do a fine, our stock is going to go up 10 times as much as the fine. They know it. We know it. So it's a symbolic penalty, but not a real penalty. And yet we'll nitpick about what the law should say and forget the fact that who's writing the law, who's enforcing the law. If you look at the administrative rules and regulations, what's happening. So I would say that we could be even more academically respectable as we are by just doing better what we're doing. And we could increase our position in the academic enterprise. But what I would like to see us do would be to change direction and build theory, but build the theory based on the real world problems of the practitioners and work closely with the practitioners. The way professors in medical schools at the teaching hospitals work very closely with the doctors that are treating the patients and learn from those doctors and those patients.
So do you think that I'm time do you think artificial intelligence is going to change any of our ways of looking at the world, or do you think we're going to be?
I don't know. I don't know enough about it. But what worries me is that what artificial intelligence means in practice is gathering massive amounts of data that used to be private and then creating fake social media stories where we embed our products, our services, our political ideas to manipulate the people who think the social media is sort of, I remember in the Vietnam War, you had the people who were opposed to the Vietnam War, you had the hippies. The hippies were building their separate worlds, which was very different than the people who were acting. And there was some overlap.
So
But-
what about us in the working in the emerging economies? I know you do some work in those economies. How is that different? Is that the same?
The crony capitalism structural is worse. And there's systematic corruption at the top, the middle, and the bottom.
Just all the way through.
But in the developed countries where it is a problem, it's more at the top than at the middle or the bottom. And in a few countries like Scandinavia, where they have very little corruption anywhere, if you look at the transparency index, you flip it and you say not which companies or which countries do the politicians receive the money, which companies give it. And the Scandinavian companies are at the top of giving money to politicians in third world countries. Sort of the when in Rome, do as the Romans. And even when they're strong enough not to do in a third world country, when they come to America, which is such a huge part of their market, they can't not play the American campaign contribution game. And even when they're spending much less than an American pharma company to the politicians, and they're feeling good about that, they're still spending vastly more than they would in their own countries.
Gretchen, do you have questions?
I do have a question about your relationship with business and practitioners. You've talked a bit about working extensively with those organizations during your career. Are there any specific companies or organizations you've worked with where your ideas have really gotten traction and you think that
Yes.
you've made a difference? Can you talk about that partnership and what
Not
made it
by
work?
name, no, because they're still in these countries and subject to retaliation. Now, if you do something good, let's say an American pharma company, you don't want to brag about it, because that puts pressure on the competitors and the politicians to come down even harder on you because you're a rate breaker. So it's got to be slow, steady, low publicity progress. Let me just give you one example. I worked with a compliance officer in an emerging market country, and the health minister was demanding something like 10 million euro. And if they gave him the 10 million, he would give them a 7-year monopoly on all the drugs in the national health system and the machine, the delivery mechanisms that they manufactures. So that's the carrot. And the stick is, if you don't do that, you're going to get nothing. So one European company said, okay, we'll pay. The American competitor was on the fence. And the other European company that I was working with, we came up with a strategy of writing a letter to the CEO of the other European company and saying, if you don't reverse this, and we'll know that you didn't, because all the salesmen talk to each other, it's going to be released in your own company's market that you're a corrupt company. And in the home country, they're pretending to be wonderful. Now, what happens when you have bad publicity is that your price-earnings ratio goes from, the price is 20 times earnings per share to 10 times earnings per share. Now, in the current mantra of liberal corporate, and liberal in the European sense, if God created man to maximize shareholder value and corporations to maximize...
Not women.
No, the women are not so different than the men in these... that's a real incentive to protect their shareholder value by not paying the corruption, because what they gain from the corruption is less than what's going to happen to their shareholder value, which happened to British Petroleum, which happened to Volkswagen. And I could name a whole bunch of other companies except the one I'm working on. So,
have you found that working with organizations like the Society for Business Ethics or the Ethics and Compliance Officer Association or other groups have enabled your ideas to become more adopted, widespread, incorporated into the way companies do their work or the way professors teach our students around the world?
I think a little bit, but not nearly as much as I had hoped for when I was younger. And part of that's my own fault. Well, part of that is an unrealistic expectation of what academics, even in professional societies, have the power to do. But also at the meso level, the organizational level, this kind of stuff is not nearly as well rewarded in the promotion tenure as the more abstract kind of stuff. There was once a dean at Northwestern University who told the ethics chair there, the reason I only hire psychologists for the ethics chair is they will never criticize one of my donor companies.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's what happened.
Yeah.
Tom, did you have a question?
Yeah. What's with attacking psychologists all of a sudden? No, I have this one question, and it is an interesting one. Feel free to ignore it. But everybody's been talking about working interdisciplinary, in the field of business ethics. But within the discipline itself, there seems to be different camps, and some don't talk to others, etc. There's some of the philosopher kings, and then there's some of the more activists and everything. How do you see people? Do you see any way they can work more cohesively together?
The thing that's wonderful about this society is the individuals are much better than the camps that they're in. So the same individuals in these various different camps are very often really wonderful people. And on a personal level, you can work with people in different camps. Occasionally, I think we take ourselves a little too seriously and we make enemies because you're in the wrong camp.
That's a very sort
It's like
of
a different religious war or something,
Are
you
the
know?
camps are they divided on different grounds?
Yes, but then Pat comes around, invites everybody to dinner, and they get to know each other. And
To
they,
somebody outside, tell me what those are.
oh my gosh, there's the classic ones, the Aristotelians, the Kantians, the utilitarian, and the postmodern. On the economic side, sometimes there's a problem in academia. We become the high priests of the crooks because we don't want to look too closely about what they're doing. We become the apologists. Why the current system is the best of all possible worlds. We become the Dr. Pangloss. But yes, on a personal level, you can bridge these and have good creative. But sometimes if we, someone says, why are the politics and academia so vicious? Because the stakes are so small. And we create enemies over theoretical differences that don't warrant personal enmity.
Tell us a little bit about the people. I think we've been asking folks about the names of individuals who you view as giants in the field, influencers.
On a personal level, Pat Waring, she's the one that holds a lot of people, different camps together. I say, you do a better job of that than anybody. And then we have the key representatives of the different groups, like Norman Bowie, with respect to Kantianism. Social contracts. Donaldson, Ed Freeman, multiple constituencies, multiple stakeholders. We have the people that originally brought in the psychology. We have the people that originally brought in the social psych, the people that brought in the sociology, the people that brought in the cultural, the people that brought in the postmodern. And sometimes we reinvent a lot of stuff. The academy's just as bad. Academy of Management, for example, a lot of current institutional theory, which has the highest growing membership in the Academy of Management, in my opinion, is largely a reinvention of 19th century German social philosophy, recognizing the importance of the macro.
That big German whose name is Luhmann.
Pardon me?
Luhmann, isn't it? He was a German 20th century thing.
Oh, yes, but you could go back to Hegel, you could go to Marx, you could go to Gadamer and Heidegger and Derrida and Foucault and Said and so that whole line of.
As a field, then, is it still in growth stage? Is it a mature stage, or is it ready for a Kuhnian kind of jump?
I think it needs a Kuhnian kind of jump, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. I think it'll be doing more efficiently what we've done in the past. I don't know. What do you think, Pat?
I'm not.
You're
on the hot spot. I pushed today for a Kuhnian jump, but no.
Yeah.
But they're not. It's exactly right. I should have said put it that way. But that's what I don't see.
Yeah.
That everyone just nods and says, "Yes, that's nice." Pats me on the head, and off they go with the same, doing the same.
Yeah.
And unless we have that, we're not going to change.
Which is the single loop. We're making things more efficient without questioning the
rest of the loops.
Yeah, and you know, if we can all agree the world doesn't seem to be getting a whole lot better, and we keep doing the same thing over and over again, it's not working.
Yeah. That's Beckett now.
Yes, yes, good Irishman, good Irishman. So Yeats and Beckett, they were the first postmodernists. Yeah. That Yeats's poem about the second coming. Yeah, boy.
I had a student once who was taking English from a friend of mine, and he was Greek, and so his English wasn't very good. And so he said, "Could I paint the second coming instead of writing?"
Oh, wow.
Which he did, and I ended up with this.
Wow.
And it's very powerful.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah.
That's a side.
Yeah. Yeah. But the Irish were one of the first colonies, so they knew what it was to be the victim. And they knew the structural stuff was against them.
We had a long time to think about it.
Yeah, like 500 years, 700 years. The Greeks did too, with the Turks.
A little bit of colonization does nobody any harm, that's all.
I'm going to sneak away.
Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts, things you want to get in there? Then?
And thank you. I'll see you later for dinner.
Great, good. I would say that the key thing is, for me, if I had one thing to wish for, is we change the epistemology to be much more about practice-based theory building, practitioner gaps in the practice that we could use to build theory.
Do you not need to have a form of habitus before you do the praxis end of things? That you've trained them that they have to not just adopt the cloak of the ethical practice, but to actually, live it. Or is that too vocational?
Yes, but it's hard to live it in academia.
No, I meant in the people that you try and get to, the practitioners out there.
Yes, and there are a number of ways you can do that. One of the best ways is teaching evening MBA students who are working in the daytime. They know what's going on. An even better way, if you can do it, is what I do a lot of, is executive education, where you're teaching people that are 20 years out of an MBA program, and they really know what's going on.